Imagine discovering that everything you believed about your king could destroy your faith, your family, and possibly your life. Sister Cordelia Ashworth pressed her quill against the parchment, but the words she had just copied made her hand tremble like autumn leaves in a storm. The monastery scriptorium smelled of wet ink and old leather. But today there was something else in the air: fear. The morning light filtered through narrow windows, casting long shadows across the wooden desks where monks bent over their copying work. But Cordelia was not copying psalms or prayers today. She was copying something that could topple kingdoms. "Sister Cordelia," came the voice of Brother Marcus from across the room. "The abbot wishes to see you in his private chamber." Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Did he know what she had discovered? The document hidden beneath the pile of religious texts spoke of a conspiracy so vast it reached from the lowest baron to King Edward himself. But she was supposed to be copying recipes for herbal remedies, not reading about planned assassinations and stolen crown jewels. At 28 years old, Cordelia had spent 10 years in this monastery, sent here when her father, Baron Ashworth, lost everything in a failed grain investment. To save the family honor, he had said, though they both knew he simply could not afford another mouth to feed. Therefore, she had learned to read Latin better than most priests, to write more beautifully than royal scribes, and to listen more carefully than anyone suspected. But today, her careful listening had led her to something extraordinary and terrifying. The document spoke of King Edward's planned invasion of France, but more shocking still, it revealed that several English barons were secretly funding French resistance. The names listed included some of the most powerful lords in England, men who dined with the king and pledged loyalty while simultaneously plotting his downfall. Sister Cordelia, Brother Marcus, called again, more insistently this time. She quickly covered the document with a collection of hymns, her mind racing. If this information was true, it meant that England's military campaigns were doomed from the start. It meant that good men were dying not because of foreign enemies, but because of domestic traitors. But it also meant that revealing this truth could save countless lives. Therefore, she stood slowly, smoothing her simple brown habit, and walked toward the abbotess' chamber. But as she walked, a terrible thought occurred to her. What if the abbot already knew about the conspiracy? What if he was part of it? The monastery had always seemed like a sanctuary, a place where truth and righteousness prevailed. But now, Cordelia wondered if even God's house could be corrupted by human ambition and greed. Her footsteps echoed in the stone corridor, each step taking her closer to a confrontation that would change her life forever. She paused before the heavy wooden door of the abbot's chamber, her hand raised to knock. But before she could, she heard voices from within, male voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones. One voice belonged to Abbot Gregorius, but the other was unfamiliar, and they were discussing her. "The girl has seen too much," the unknown voice said. "We cannot allow her to leave this room with that knowledge." Cordelia's blood turned to ice water. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall, straining to hear more, but understanding with crystal clarity that her life was now in mortal danger. The vassal-s dilemma, Sir Edmund Blackthorne, had served Lord Reginald Harcastle for 15 years. But today would be the day he finally understood the true cost of loyalty. The great hall of Harcastle Manor buzzed with tension thick enough to cut with a sword. Edmund stood at attention, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, watching as his lord paced before the massive stone fireplace. At 35, Edmund had fought in 3 campaigns, saved his lord's life twice, and never received so much as an acre of land for his service. But today felt different. Today, Lord Hardcastle looked desperate. "My faithful Edmund," Lord Hardcastle began, his voice carrying an edge that made Edmund's warrior instincts prickle with alertness. "I have a task for you that requires your absolute discretion and unwavering loyalty." Edmund had heard these words before. They usually preceded requests that danced dangerously close to dishonor, but which he had always managed to fulfill while keeping his conscience intact. Therefore, he nodded respectfully, waiting for the details that would undoubtedly complicate his life. "The serfs in the eastern fields have been organizing resistance against the new taxes," Lord Hardcastle continued, his pale blue eyes glinting with cold calculation. "They refuse to pay the additional levies I require for the king's war efforts. I need you to make an example of them." Edmund's jaw tightened. The eastern fields housed nearly 30 families, including women and children. These were people he had protected during Viking raids, people whose children ran to greet him when he rode through their settlements. "What manner of example, my lord?" "Burn their grain stores, all of them. Winter is coming, and hunger will teach them the price of defiance." The words hit Edmund like a physical blow. Destroying the grain stores would mean death sentences for entire families. Children would starve. Elderly people would perish in the cold. But refusing a direct order from his lord could mean death or exile for Edmund himself, and, more importantly, it could mean a hopeless future for his 13-year-old son, Marcus. Marcus was Edmund's bastard child, born to a serving woman who had died in childbirth. The boy was bright, strong, and showed promise as a potential knight. But without land or legitimate birth, his future depended entirely on Edmund's standing. With Lord Hardcastle, if Edmund fell from grace, Marcus would become nothing more than another peasant, destined for a life of back-breaking labor and early death. "My lord," Edmund said carefully, choosing his words like a man walking through a field of hidden traps. "Perhaps there might be another way to demonstrate your authority. The serfs are already struggling with the current taxes. If we destroy their grain, they will understand that I am not a lord to be trifled with," Hardcastle interrupted, his voice rising. "And if you question my orders, perhaps I need to find a vassal with more steel in his spine." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Edmund felt the familiar weight of his sword at his side, but for the first time in his life, he wondered if honor and loyalty were the same thing. He had always believed that serving his lord faithfully was the highest virtue a knight could possess. But now, faced with an order that would make him complicit in mass murder, he began to understand that loyalty without conscience was just another form of cowardice. "I understand, my lord," Edmund said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "When do you wish this task completed?" "Tonight, under cover of darkness." And Edmund, Lord Hardcastle, stepped closer, his breath reeking of wine and something rotten. "If word of this conversation leaves this room, I will personally ensure that your bastard son meets an unfortunate accident." Edmund's hand moved instinctively toward his sword hilt, but he stopped himself. Violence would solve nothing and would only guarantee Marcus's death. Instead, he bowed stiffly and turned to leave. But as he walked away, his mind was already racing with possibilities. There was a group of rebels in the forest, men who had grown tired of the endless abuses of the feudal system. They called themselves the Brotherhood of the Green Oak, and they had been trying to recruit Edmund for months. He had always refused, believing his oath to Lord Hardcastle was sacred. But perhaps there were oaths more sacred than loyalty to an evil master. As Edmund stepped into the courtyard, he saw his son Marcus practicing sword forms with the other pages. The boy's face lit up when he saw his father, and he ran over with the enthusiasm of youth. "Father, watch this new technique Sir Geoffrey taught me." Edmund watched his son demonstrate a complex series of parries and thrusts, and his heart ached with the terrible knowledge that everything he decided in the next few hours would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of the boy he loved more than his own life. Therefore, that night, Sir Edmund Blackthorne would face the most important choice of his life: honor his oath to a corrupt lord, or break that oath to save innocent lives and secure his son's future. But he already knew, deep in his warrior's heart, that some oaths were meant to be broken. The widow's rebellion, Margot Field, had buried her husband on a Tuesday, and by Thursday she was planning a revolution. The common fields of Harcastle Manor stretched like a patchwork quilt under the grey autumn sky, but today they felt more like a battlefield. Margot stood in the centre of the largest field, her rough-spun dress whipping in the cold wind, addressing a crowd of 37 serfs who had finally decided they would rather die fighting than live starving. At 41, Margot had the kind of strength that comes from bearing children, burying loved ones, and surviving countless winters when the choice was between eating bread or feeding it to your livestock. Her husband, Thomas, had died during the harvest, crushed beneath a cartload of grain that toppled when the wheel broke. But the grain belonged to Lord Harcastle, so Thomas was just another casualty in the endless war between survival and service. "Listen to me, all of you," Margot called out, her voice carrying across the field with the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Lord Harcastle demands we pay double taxes this year, double, while our children go to bed hungry, and our elders cough themselves to death because we cannot afford firewood." Murmurs of anger rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. These were people who understood hardship, but who also understood when hardship crossed the line into cruelty. The new taxes would leave them with barely enough food to survive until spring, and spring was still 5 months away. "But what can we do?" called out Willem the miller, a thin man whose hands were permanently stained with flour. "If we refuse to pay, Lord Harcastle will have us thrown in the dungeons. Or worse." Margot had been expecting this question, and she had been preparing her answer for weeks. "We do not refuse to pay. We negotiate." The crowd fell silent. Serfs did not negotiate with lords. Serfs obeyed, or serfs died. But Margot had been talking to serfs from other manors, and she had learned something interesting. Lord Harcastle was not the only nobleman demanding increased taxes. Therefore, the problem was not local greed, but something larger and more systematic. Lord Harcastle needs our taxes to pay his own lord. Who needs them to pay the king? Who needs them to fund his wars in France? Margot explained, her voice steady and clear. "But here is what Lord Harcastle does not want us to know. If we all refuse to work, if every serf in every manor stops producing food, the entire system collapses." "That is treason," whispered Agnes the seamstress, glancing around nervously as if Lord Harcastle himself might be hiding behind a haystack. "No," Margot replied firmly. "Treason is betraying your king or your country. But we are not betraying anyone. We are simply demanding fair treatment. We are demanding the right to keep enough of our own harvest to feed our own families." She pulled a folded piece of parchment from her apron pocket. She could not read, but Father Benedict had helped her memorize the contents. "I have been in contact with serfs from 12 other manors. All of them face the same impossible taxes. All of them are ready to act together. The crowd pressed closer, their eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. This was either the beginning of their salvation or the beginning of their doom, and they all knew it. "What are you proposing?" asked Robert the blacksmith, his massive arms crossed over his chest. "We stop working, all of us, at the same time. No planting, no harvesting, no maintaining the manor buildings. We tell Lord Harkessel that we will resume our duties when he reduces the taxes to a level that allows us to survive. And if he refuses," Robert pressed. Margot's eyes hardened like winter ice. "Then he starves along with us, because without our labor, he has nothing to offer his own lord. Without his tribute, he loses his lands. Without his lands, he becomes just another hungry man in a world full of hungry men." The plan was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was also brilliant in its simplicity. The feudal system depended entirely on the labor of the serfs. If that labor disappeared, even temporarily, the entire hierarchy would collapse like a house built on sand. But Margot knew the risks. Lord Harkessel could call in soldiers from neighboring manors. He could have the leaders of the rebellion hanged as examples to others. He could burn their homes and scatter their families to the winds. Therefore, the plan had to be executed perfectly, with absolute unity and unwavering resolve. "I am asking each of you to risk everything," Margot said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I am asking you to risk your lives, your families, your homes. But I am also offering you something that none of us have ever had before. I am offering you choice." The wind picked up, sending leaves swirling around the gathered serfs like omens of change. Margot looked into the faces of her neighbors, her friends, her fellow survivors, and saw her own determination reflected back at her. "Who stands with me?" she asked. One by one, hands rose into the grey sky. 37 hands, belonging to 37 people who had decided that dignity was worth dying for. But as the last hand rose, Margot caught sight of a figure watching them from the edge of the woods. A figure in the armor of a knight, sitting motionless on a black horse. Sir Edmund Blackthorne had been watching their meeting, and now he knew about their rebellion. The question was, would he report them to Lord Harkessel, or would he join them? Because Margot suspected that they were not the only ones who had grown tired of the current system. The revolution was about to begin, but first they would need to discover who their true allies were. The Lord's Gambit, Lord Reginald Harkessel, stood before his ornate mirror, adjusting his velvet doublet, while his world crumbled around him like week-old bread. At 52, he had mastered the art of appearing wealthy while being completely, utterly, catastrophically broke. The reflection staring back at him showed a man who looked every inch the prosperous feudal lord. His greying hair was perfectly groomed, his beard trimmed to aristocratic precision, and his clothing spoke of wealth and power. But appearances, as Lord Harkessel knew better than anyone, could be devastatingly deceptive. My lord, his steward, Geoffrey, entered the chamber with the nervous energy of a man delivering terrible news. "The grain merchants from London have arrived for payment. They are waiting in the great hall." Harkessel's stomach clenched like a fist. The grain merchants represented his last hope of maintaining his facade of prosperity. He had borrowed heavily against this year's harvest to fund what he had told everyone was strategic investment in the king's war efforts. But the truth was far more embarrassing and infinitely more dangerous. He had gambled, not on horses or dice, but on something far more treacherous. He had bet everything on his ability to marry his daughter, Isabella, to Lord Pemberton's eldest son. The marriage contract would have brought enough dowry money to solve all his financial problems, restore his reputation, and secure his family's future for generations. Therefore, he had spent money he did not have on elaborate feasts, expensive gifts, and a lifestyle designed to impress the Pemberton family. He had commissioned new tapestries, hired additional servants, and even purchased a pair of white Arabian horses to demonstrate his wealth and sophistication. But 3 weeks ago, everything had collapsed. Lord Pemberton had withdrawn the marriage proposal without explanation, leaving Hardcastle with enormous debts, impossible obligations, and a reputation that would be destroyed the moment his creditors discovered the truth. "Tell the merchants I will join them shortly," Hardcastle commanded, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. "And Geoffrey, send word to Sir Edmund. I have another task for him." Geoffrey's expression flickered with something. That might have been concern or disapproval, but he bowed and departed without comment. Hardcastle knew his steward suspected something was amiss, but Geoffrey was smart enough to keep his suspicions to himself. The plan forming in Hardcastle's mind was desperate, dangerous, and probably doomed to failure. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and he was rapidly running out of both time and options. He would blame the serfs. He would claim that their rebellion had destroyed his grain stores and made it impossible to honor his debts. Then he would ask the grain merchants to extend his credit in exchange for a share of next year's harvest. It was a lie that would buy him time, but time was all he needed, because he had one final card to play. Isabella was beautiful, intelligent, and still unmarried at 19. There were other wealthy lords with unmarried sons, other opportunities for advantageous marriages. He simply needed to find the right match and execute it before his creditors lost patience. But as he prepared to face the grain merchants, Hardcastle could not shake the feeling that events were spiraling beyond his control. The serfs were organizing resistance. Sir Edmund seemed increasingly reluctant to follow orders, and there were disturbing rumors circulating about documents being discovered in the monastery. Documents that could expose secrets far more dangerous than his financial troubles. Hardcastle had spent years cultivating relationships with certain French nobles, relationships that provided him with valuable information about English military plans, information that he had been selling to fund his lifestyle and gambling debts. It was technically treason, but he had always justified it as pragmatic business. After all, he reasoned, if England was foolish enough to launch doomed military campaigns, why should he not profit from that foolishness? But if those documents existed, if they contained evidence of his correspondence with French agents, then bankruptcy would be the least of his problems. Treason was punishable by death, and death was a considerably more permanent solution to his troubles than he was prepared to accept. Therefore, he needed to discover what the monastery knew, eliminate any evidence of his activities, and find a way to restore his finances before his entire world collapsed. It was an impossible task that would require careful planning, absolute ruthlessness, and more luck than any reasonable person could expect. But Lord Reginald Hardcastle had not survived this long in the treacherous world of feudal politics by being reasonable. He had survived by being clever, manipulative, and willing to sacrifice anyone and anything to protect his own interests. As he walked toward the great hall to face his creditors, Hardcastle was already calculating which of his vassals could be sacrificed, which of his secrets could be buried, and which of his enemies could be eliminated. Because in the game of feudal survival, there were only two outcomes, victory or death, and Harkessel had no intention of dying. The abbot's revelation, Abbot Gregorius, had been keeping secrets for 40 years, but today he would finally understand that some secrets are too dangerous to keep and too dangerous to reveal. The monastery's private chamber smelled of ancient parchment and burning candles, but today there was another scent in the air, the metallic smell of fear. At 60 years old, Gregorius had seen kings rise and fall, witnessed plagues that decimated entire regions, and presided over enough confessions to understand that human nature was both infinitely creative and consistently disappointing. But the documents spread across his oak desk presented a problem unlike any he had faced before. The papers revealed a conspiracy that reached from the lowest village priest to the highest levels of the English court. Names, dates, amounts of money, and detailed plans for military sabotage. It was a treasonous web so complex and far-reaching that exposing it would destroy half the nobility in England, while concealing it would make him complicit in the deaths of thousands of innocent soldiers. "Brother Marcus," he called to his assistant, who had been hovering nervously near the doorway, "bring me the wine, the good wine from the French abbey." Marcus scurried away, leaving Gregorius alone with his terrible knowledge. The irony was not lost on him that the wine he was about to drink came from the very French abbey that had been secretly funding English traitors for the past 3 years. The conspiracy had been elegant in its simplicity. French agents would identify financially desperate English nobles, offer them substantial payments in exchange for military intelligence, and gradually build a network of informants throughout the English court. The information would be used to ensure that English military campaigns failed. English supply lines were disrupted, and English armies were led into carefully prepared traps. But the conspiracy had grown beyond simple military intelligence. The French agents had begun recruiting English nobles to actively sabotage their own country's war efforts. Supply convoys would be attacked by bandits who knew exactly when and where to strike. Castle defenses would mysteriously fail at crucial moments. Messages between English commanders would be intercepted and altered. Gregorius had discovered the documents 3 months ago, hidden in a collection of religious manuscripts donated by a dying nobleman. The nobleman, Baron Ashworth, had apparently been keeping records of the conspiracy as insurance against his French handlers. But when Baron Ashworth died suddenly of fever, the documents had been accidentally donated to the monastery, along with his collection of religious texts. Therefore, Gregorius found himself in possession of information that could save England, or destroy it, depending on how he chose to act. But every possible course of action led to disaster. If he revealed the conspiracy to King Edward, hundreds of English nobles would be executed for treason, creating chaos and civil war that would make England vulnerable to actual French invasion. If he kept the secret, thousands of English soldiers would continue dying in wars that were rigged from the beginning. But there was a third option, one that had been taking shape in his mind for weeks. He could use the information to force the conspirators to abandon their treasonous activities without exposing them publicly. It would require careful negotiation, absolute discretion, and a willingness to make deals with traitors. But it might be the only way to save both England and the lives of the men whose names appeared in the documents. Brother Marcus returned with the wine, his hands shaking slightly as he poured. "Father Abbot, Sir Edmund Blackthorne is here too. See you, he says, it is urgent." Gregorius felt his pulse quicken. Sir Edmund was one of the few truly honourable knights he knew, a man whose loyalty was beyond question. But Sir Edmund also served Lord Harcastle, and Lord Harcastle's name appeared frequently in the treasonous documents. "Send him in," Gregorius commanded, quickly covering the documents with a collection of sermon notes. Sir Edmund entered the chamber with the controlled movements of a professional warrior. But Gregorius could see the tension in his shoulders, the tight line of his jaw. This was a man wrestling with impossible choices. "Father Abbot," Edmund began, his voice carefully controlled. "I need your counsel on a matter of conscience. Speak freely, my son. These walls have heard many confessions and kept many secrets." Edmund glanced around the chamber, as if checking for hidden listeners, then moved closer to the desk. "My lord has commanded me to perform an action that I believe to be evil. But refusing his command would mean death or exile, and would destroy my son's future." Gregorius nodded slowly. He had been expecting this conversation, though not necessarily with Sir Edmund. "What manner of action?" "He wants me to burn the grain stores of the eastern fields, to starve the serfs into submission." The abbot felt a chill run down his spine. Lord Harcastle was escalating his oppression, which meant he was becoming desperate. Desperate men made dangerous choices, and dangerous choices led to unexpected consequences. "And what does your conscience tell you?" Gregorius asked carefully. "My conscience tells me that starving children to maintain political control is an abomination before God. But my practical mind tells me that defying my Lord will accomplish nothing except my own destruction." Gregorius studied the knight's face, seeing the genuine anguish there. Sir Edmund was exactly the kind of man he needed as an ally, someone with both the moral integrity to do what was right and the practical skills to do it effectively. "What if I told you," Gregorius said slowly, "that Lord Harcastle's position is not as secure as he would have you believe? What if I told you that there are forces at work that could remove him from power without requiring you to break your oaths of loyalty?" Edmund's eyes sharpened with interest. "What manner of forces?" Gregorius made his decision. The conspiracy of silence had to end, but it had to end carefully, strategically, with minimal bloodshed and maximum justice. Sir Edmund would be his instrument of change, the kind that require absolute discretion, unwavering courage, and a commitment to justice that transcends personal loyalty. Gregorius replied, "Are you prepared to hear secrets that will change your understanding of everything you thought you knew about this kingdom?" Sir Edmund straightened, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his sword hilt. "I am prepared, Father Abbot." The mercenary's choice, Gareth Ironwood, had killed men for gold, honor, and survival. But he had never killed a man for discovering he was that man's son. The tavern in the village of Millhaven reeked of stale ale and unwashed bodies. But tonight it reeked of something else entirely. Opportunity. At 38, Gareth had the scars of a professional soldier and the instincts of a man who had learned that trusting anyone was usually a fatal mistake. But the letter in his leather pouch was forcing him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about trust, family, and the strange twists of fate. The letter had arrived 3 days ago, delivered by a nervous monk who had ridden hard from St. Bartholomew's monastery. The parchment bore the seal of Abbot Gregorius, a man Gareth had never met but whose reputation for wisdom and discretion was known throughout the kingdom. "Gareth Ironwood," the letter began, "I have information regarding your parentage that may be of considerable interest to you. If you seek answers to questions you have carried since childhood, come to my monastery before the next full moon. Come alone, and come prepared to learn truths that will change your understanding of your place in this world." Gareth had spent his entire adult life as a mercenary, fighting in petty wars between minor nobles, surviving on his sword skills and his ability to disappear when conflicts became too dangerous or unprofitable. But he had also spent his entire life wondering about his origins. He remembered nothing before the age of 7, when he had been found wandering the roads by a company of soldiers who had raised him as one of their own. Therefore, when the monk had pressed the letter into his hands and ridden away without explanation, Gareth had felt something he had not experienced in decades. Hope, not hope for gold or glory, but hope for answers to the questions that had haunted his dreams since childhood. But now, sitting in this tavern and listening to the conversations of local farmers and craftsmen, Gareth was beginning to understand that his personal quest for identity had intersected with something much larger and infinitely more dangerous. The farmers were talking about rebellion. The craftsmen were discussing rumors of conspiracy among the nobility, and everyone was whispering about strange happenings at Lord Harcastle's manor, where knights were refusing orders and serfs were organizing resistance. "Mark my words," said Willem the baker, his flour-dusted apron making him look like a ghost in the dim tavern light. "Something big is coming. The natural order is shifting, and when the natural order shifts, blood flows like rivers." Gareth had seen enough revolutions to know that Willem was probably right. The signs were all there: economic desperation, political instability, and the kind of social tension that preceded either massive reform or massive bloodshed, usually bloodshed. But as he listened to the conversations around him, Gareth began to notice something interesting. The people were not simply complaining about their circumstances, they were organizing, they were planning. They were preparing to take action that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the region. "You are not from around here," observed a voice from the shadows near the fireplace. Gareth turned to see a woman in her 40s, dressed in the simple clothing of a serf but carrying herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to leadership. Her eyes were intelligent and calculating, studying Gareth with the intensity of a general evaluating a potential ally or enemy. "No," Gareth replied carefully. "I am just passing through, are you?" the woman asked, moving closer. "Because you have the look of a professional soldier, and professional soldiers do not usually pass through Millhaven unless they have business here." Gareth recognized the tactical nature of the conversation. This woman was probing for information, trying to determine whether he represented a threat or an opportunity. He decided to be direct. "My name is Gareth Ironwood. I am a mercenary, and I am here to meet with Abbot Gregorius at St. Bartholomew's Monastery. I have no interest in local politics or local conflicts." The woman's expression shifted subtly, and Gareth realized he had said something significant. "I am Margot Fieldstone," she said, extending her hand in a gesture that was both greeting and challenge. "And if you were meeting with Abbot Gregorius, then you are already involved in local politics, whether you realize it or not." Before Gareth could respond, the tavern door burst open and Sir Edmund Blackthorne strode in, his armor catching the firelight and his expression grim with purpose. The entire tavern fell silent, but instead of the fear that usually accompanied the arrival of a knight, Gareth sensed something different in the atmosphere. Anticipation. "Margot," Sir Edmund called out, ignoring the stares of the other patrons. "We need to talk. All of us. The situation has changed." Margot nodded and gestured for Gareth to follow her to a corner table where they could speak privately. As they walked, Gareth realized that he was no longer just a mercenary seeking answers about his past. He was about to become part of something that would determine the future of everyone in the region. The abbot has revealed information that changes everything, Sir Edmund began once they were seated. Lord Hardcastle is not just a corrupt feudal lord. He is a traitor who has been selling military secrets to French agents for years. Gareth felt his mercenary instincts sharpen. Treason accusations were dangerous weapons that could be used to destroy enemies or justify almost any action. What evidence supports this claim? Sir Edmund produced a rolled parchment from his cloak. Documents discovered in the monastery. Correspondence between Hardcastle and French agents. Payment records. Details of planned sabotage operations. Enough evidence to hang him 10 times over. Margot leaned forward, her eyes bright with possibility. This could be the weapon we need to break the feudal system entirely. If we can expose Hardcastle's treason, we can demand reforms that will protect the serfs and limit the power of corrupt nobles. But Gareth was thinking like a soldier, and soldiers understood that weapons could be turned against those who wielded them. And what happens when King Edward decides that anyone who possesses evidence of treason without immediately reporting it to the crown is also guilty of treason? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Sir Edmund and Margot exchanged glances, and Gareth realized they had been so focused on the opportunity for justice that they had not fully considered the risks of pursuing it. We need someone with no ties to the local feudal structure, Margot said slowly. Someone who can carry the evidence to the king without being accused of personal motivation or local conspiracy. Sir Edmund nodded. Someone whose loyalty cannot be questioned because he has no local loyalties to question. Both of them were looking at Gareth, and he suddenly understood why the abbot had summoned him. Not just to learn about his parentage, but to serve as an instrument of justice in a conspiracy that threatened the stability of the entire kingdom. What exactly are you asking me to do? Gareth asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. We are asking you to choose, Sir Edmund replied, between gold and justice, between safety and honor, between the life of a mercenary who serves only himself and the life of a man who serves something greater. Gareth looked around the tavern at the faces of people who had spent their entire lives under the boot of an oppressive system, people who were finally ready to risk everything for the chance to live with dignity. Then he thought about the letter in his pouch and the answers it might contain about his identity and his origins. Therefore, Gareth Ironwood made the choice that would transform him from a rootless mercenary into the instrument of revolution. That would reshape the feudal world forever. Epilogue: The Price of Truth. 6 months later, the world had changed in ways that none of them could have predicted. Sister Cordelia Ashworth stood in the garden of St. Bartholomew's Monastery. But she was no longer Sister Cordelia. The documents she had discovered had not only exposed Lord Hardcastle as treason, but had led to a complete investigation of corruption throughout the English nobility. King Edward, grateful for her service to the crown, had granted her a royal pardon from her monastic vows and a pension that allowed her to live independently for the first time in her adult life. But independence, she had discovered, was both a gift and a burden. She was now free to leave the monastery, free to marry, free to live whatever life she chose. Yet she found herself staying, not because she was required to, but because she had found purpose in her work, copying and preserving important documents. She had become the monastery's official archivist, responsible for maintaining records that would help prevent future conspiracies. Sir Edmund Blackthorne had been granted lands of his own, a reward for his role in exposing the treason and his service as a royal messenger. His son Marcus was now a legitimate heir with a secure future. But Edmund had learned that owning land came with responsibilities he had never fully understood as a vassal. He spent his days learning to be a just lord, trying to create the kind of feudal relationship he had always wished to serve under. Margot Fieldstone had become something unprecedented in English history, a serf who had successfully negotiated with the crown. The serf rebellion she had organized had been folded into the larger investigation of noble corruption, and King Edward had issued royal decrees limiting the taxes that could be imposed on agricultural workers. Margot now served as an official representative of the common people, traveling between villages to ensure that the new protections were being enforced. Lord Reginald Harkesel had been executed for treason, his lands seized by the crown and redistributed to knights who had proven their loyalty. His daughter Isabella had married a minor baron from a neighboring region, escaping her father's disgrace, but carrying the burden of his reputation. Abbot Gregorius had been elevated to bishop, recognized for his wisdom in handling the conspiracy. With minimal bloodshed and maximum justice, he now advised the king on matters of political reform and continued to maintain the secret archives that helped prevent future treasonous activities. But it was Gareth Ironwood whose story had taken the most unexpected turn. The letter from Abbot Gregorius had revealed that Gareth was the bastard son of Lord Pemberton, one of the most powerful nobles in England. Lord Pemberton had acknowledged his paternity and offered Gareth a place in his household, complete with title, lands, and legitimacy. Gareth had refused. Instead, he had used his newfound knowledge of his noble heritage to gain access to King Edward's court, where he had personally delivered the evidence of the conspiracy. His reward had been a royal commission as captain of the king's investigation, a new position created specifically to identify and eliminate corruption among the nobility. Therefore, the rootless mercenary had found his purpose not in claiming his birthright, but in serving justice. He travelled throughout England, investigating reports of noble corruption and ensuring that the feudal system served the people rather than exploiting them. As Cordelia watched the sun set over the monastery walls, she reflected on the strange turns of fate that had brought them all together. They had each faced impossible choices, each risked everything they valued, and each discovered that sometimes the greatest rewards came not from getting what you thought you wanted, but from finding what you never knew you needed. The feudal system still existed, but it had been transformed by their actions. Serfs had protections they had never possessed before. Knights served lords who were accountable for their actions. Lords answered to a king who now understood that his power depended on the consent and cooperation of all his subjects, not just the wealthy ones. But perhaps most importantly, they had proven that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, could choose to be heroes rather than victims. They had shown that courage, honor, and justice were not the exclusive privileges of the nobility, but the birthright of anyone willing to pay the price for them. The price of truth, as they had all learned, was everything you thought you knew about yourself and your place in the world. But the reward was the chance to build something better from the ashes of what had come before. And in the end, that had been worth every sacrifice they had made. FEUD.